Mr. Chair. I fully support what the Honourable Annette King has been talking about in terms of children, and that children, regardless of the source of their parents' income, deserve the same support. They deserve a warm, dry home. They deserve a good high-quality public education. They deserve childcare and healthcare. And no child should be separated from their entitlements as a citizen simply because of the source of their parents' income. The problem is that, and I have to say even under the last government, that separation around treating children differently because of the income source from that family was a fact. And one of the options, for example, that was mentioned earlier was around if the work testing required 20 hours instead of 15, then it would be in line with the capacity to get access to the in-work tax credit. But it's our view that there's no reason why the poorest families, who are the beneficiary families, because after the 91 tax cut, benefit cuts by the national government came into force, benefits have not been restored to anything like a livable provision for families. That as a result, the in-work tax credit has worked for some families, but it has not been extended to beneficiary families. And that means CPAG, the coalition, the Poverty Action Coalition, estimates some $1 billion has been taken out of those families because the in-work tax credit was not available to the beneficiary families who most desperately need it. So there has been a continual series of treating children of beneficiaries differently than other children, and now we see it with Peter Dunn's ridiculous idea around income splitting, which is simply going to exacerbate that gap, that somehow it's okay for the children of wealthy families to have access to a full-time parent, but beneficiary children will not, because of the work testing regime that's in this legislation. Children of beneficiaries are being discriminated against by this government. So there was part of the theory around the Future Focus Bill and the work testing, of course, has been supported, unsurprisingly, by the right-wing Welfare Working Group, who released their report early last week. One of the quotes from that report said this, that the introduction of work testing in the late 1990s at the time it was national, alongside the introduction of a more generous childcare assistance, saw a reduction in numbers of people on the DPB, and the reduction flattened out when the work test was replaced by a planning requirement. But actually, that's the Welfare Working Group saying this, but actually, if you look at the information that's provided in the report, at the facts, you'll see something quite different. The graph that accompanied this showed us a reduction in domestic purpose benefit numbers from the introduction of the DPB work test, just a very small one, but that reduction flattened out very quickly. The numbers remained flat through to the replacement of the work test by the planning requirement in 2003, and through to the introduction of the enhanced working for families and the childcare assistance packages from October 2004. And then numbers on the DPB plummeted, actually, because there was access to support for women, for sole parents who were able to go into longer periods of part-time work that was actually able to provide them with a decent income, with the support through childcare and through working for families. And so we see actually a major reduction in a dropping off in the gap between rich and poor as a result of working for families too, which helped to provide that buffer. Because there hasn't been an extension in looking at and efforts put into those who are right at the very bottom further from that, we've seen the gap between rich and poor stagnate now, and so it isn't decreasing. In fact, I would suggest that it is going to get worse once we see the impacts of this year's budget. So the Welfare Working Group has been spinning this idea that work testing will reduce benefit numbers, and in fact the evidence shows that is just not true. Numbers on the DPB will drop when there is greater employment, that is, people can move into jobs because the jobs are available and pay well enough such that they can care for their families, and when there are financial incentives like an enhanced tax credit and childcare assistance. But this bill doesn't do any of that. This bill will simply threatens sole parents with the loss of a meagre and desperately needed income. And we are talking here often about people who don't have savings, don't have huge amounts of assets, people for whom losing a benefit for a week is enough to drive them into severe poverty. Mr. Chair, is enough to drive them into extreme poverty. Now, these are people who are already having to scrimp and save, and we've seen in the paper a story today about a woman who is not eating because she cannot afford to if she wants to train. A West Auckland woman, my colleague Carmel Cipollone has got a photograph there of the newspaper report of a woman who is not eating sufficiently because she is trying to use the money, the very scarce resources she's got, to care for her child and to train herself so that she will then be able to get a better paid job so she can care for her family. That is the kind of life that beneficiaries are actually living right now. They are going without. And all of this legislation, all it does is imply, well, it doesn't even imply actually, it makes, I think, a very clear statement to the community that that beneficiaries are just bludgers, and that they're not doing they're not making these efforts. Women like the woman who was in the newspaper today is an indication of sole parents across the board, parents who need help right now to care for their kids, are working very hard to get themselves into a better situation on very meagre resources that haven't been at all dealt with by this government, and are suffering as a result, but still persevering to do what's best for their families. They are the sole parents in this country, and they deserve our support, not our denigration. There is certainly no part of the problem, of course, with this legislation is even the regulatory impact statement shows that there is no evidence that work testing DPBs like this is going to increase their income, encourage them off the benefit, be good for their children. And in fact, what we will see, and what we saw from last time, was that there were child welfare issues as a result of the work testing, with sole parents being forced to, because of the fear of losing their benefit, were forced into taking risks, some of them with some of their children, and there were serious welfare concerns that no government then further investigated, including the national government of today, and they have imposed a work test on DPB on sole parents, again knowing that there were serious child welfare issues that arose last time this happened, but they failed to investigate and check it out. And that means that this legislation, I described it as structural abuse before and I'll do it again, that means that this legislation is putting in place a program that knowingly, the government knowingly puts this in place, knowing that there are likely to be serious child welfare issues that result out of it, but they don't care. They don't care, and they're not going to do anything about it. And what they do, is provide strange incentives. For example, last week there was an announcement that foster parents will get extra support to enable them to care full-time for foster children, and that's fantastic. Why is it that a foster child is entitled to have someone take care of them full-time, but a child of a beneficiary is not? What is it about this government's judgment about the children of beneficiaries that says this government says those children of beneficiaries are not entitled to a full-time parent? Every other child is. Peter Dunn says rich children, the children of rich families, are entitled to a full-time parent. Paula Bennett says that foster children are entitled to a full-time care. What about the children of beneficiaries? Under this legislation, this government says those children are not entitled to a full-time parent to care for them so that they can be productive, healthy members of our community. So what are they doing? It is a form of structural abuse, in my view, and it is disappointing for us to have to see that and be in this House while this legislation is being discussed. But actually, it's worse for those families. It is entrenching poverty, it is entrenching poor welfare issues, it is entrenching structural systems of abuse, and it is being dictated by a national government that believes that at heart that beneficiary children are not entitled to the same support, the same entitlements as citizens as other children are. Now that is what this legislation does, that is what it says to the community. Children of beneficiaries are not entitled to the same level of support, the same entitlements, the same good health, the same good education, the same good food, the same good housing as other children are. Where does that come from? Where does that kind of attitude come from that says that those children... Why would a national government, why would any government take an attitude like that? Why are these children so different from other people's children? What have they done to deserve a government that will force their on threat of losing their income, desperately needed income, will force their families out into unsuitable, inappropriate work